The machinery of war had ground to a halt by April 1945, but the machinery of peace, that infinitely more complex apparatus of negotiation, territory and trust, was only beginning to reveal its fatal design flaws. In the smoking ruins of the Third Reich, as Allied armies converged from east and west like the closing jaws of history itself, a profound miscalculation was taking shape, one that would reshape the world for half a century and beyond. The question was not whether Germany would surrender. That outcome had been sealed months earlier in the frozen forests of the Ardennes and the rubble of Budapest, but how that surrender would unfold, who would accept it, and what political geometry would emerge from the ashes of Nazi ambition. The answer, when it came, arrived not as a single moment of capitulation, but as a series of separate surrenders, each carrying within its bureaucratic machinery the seeds of a division that would split not only Germany, but the entire European continent along lines of ideology, suspicion, and competing visions of the post-war world. This is the story of how peace itself became a weapon of war. By the spring of 1945, the German war machine existed more as concept than reality, a phantom army sustained by desperation, youth, and the terrible momentum of a regime that had staked its existence on total victory or total destruction. The Wehrmacht, once the most feared military force in human history, had been reduced to a collection of isolated garrisons, makeshift units, and increasingly desperate defensive positions scattered across a shrinking perimeter of territory that bore little resemblance to the vast European empire Hitler had commanded just 2 years earlier. The Soviet Union's winter offensive had shattered Army Group Center and driven Red Army spearheads to within artillery range of Berlin itself. From the west, American, British and Canadian forces had crossed the Rhine in force, their armoured columns racing across the North German plain with a speed that surprised even their own commanders. The industrial heartland of the Ruhr had been encircled, trapping hundreds of thousands of German troops in what was rapidly becoming an irrelevant pocket of resistance. The Luftwaffe had ceased to exist as an effective fighting force, its remaining aircraft grounded by lack of fuel, spare parts and experienced pilots. Yet even as the military situation deteriorated beyond any hope of recovery, the political machinery of the Reich continued to function with the mechanical precision that had characterized Nazi administration from its earliest days. Hitler remained in his bunker beneath the Chancellery, issuing orders to armies that no longer existed, planning counter-offensives with divisions that had been destroyed weeks earlier, and maintaining the fiction that German resistance could somehow reverse the tide of history through willpower alone. This was the paradox that would shape the final weeks of the war in Europe, a regime that had lost all capacity for military resistance but retained sufficient administrative control to influence the terms and timing of its own dissolution. The consequences of this temporal gap between military defeat and political surrender would prove more significant than anyone imagined at the time. The Allied leadership, flush with the momentum of inevitable victory, was simultaneously planning for both the final destruction of German resistance and the complex political arrangements that would govern post-war Europe. But these two objectives, military and political, operated according to different timelines and different logics. Military victory demanded speed, concentration of force, and the ruthless exploitation of German weakness. Political settlement required patience, negotiation, and the careful balance of competing national interests among the victorious allies. The seeds of separate surrender had been planted months earlier, not in any deliberate strategy, but in the fundamental contradictions that had always existed within the Grand Alliance itself. The United States, Great Britain and the Soviet Union had been united by necessity rather than ideology, bound together by the common threat of Nazi Germany, but divided by incompatible visions of what Europe should become after Hitler's defeat. Stalin's Soviet Union approached the final phase of the war with the methodical brutality that had characterized its entire campaign against Germany. The Red Army's advance was not merely military but transformative. Every captured territory was immediately reorganized according to Soviet political principles, its existing leadership eliminated or co-opted, its economic resources redirected toward Soviet recovery and expansion. For Stalin, military conquest and political revolution were inseparable aspects of the same historical process. The Western Allies, by contrast, operated within a framework of democratic decision-making that made rapid political transformation both impossible and undesirable. American and British commanders were constrained by political oversight, public opinion, and legal traditions that emphasized due process, negotiated settlement, and respect for existing property rights. Where Soviet forces imposed immediate and total change, Western forces established temporary military governments that maintained existing administrative structures while awaiting political direction from their home governments. These different approaches to occupation and control created a geographical pattern that would become increasingly significant as German resistance collapsed. Soviet forces advancing from the east encountered a German population that had been systematically evacuated, or terrorized into submission by years of Nazi propaganda about Bolshevik intentions. The civilian population that remained was often too frightened or traumatized to offer meaningful resistance to Soviet political reorganization. Western forces, approaching from the west and south, encountered German armies and civilian populations that were increasingly eager to surrender to avoid falling into Soviet hands. This asymmetry created powerful incentives for German commanders to seek separate accommodation with Western forces while continuing resistance against the Red Army, a strategy that would prove both tactically logical and strategically disastrous. The first clear indication of this emerging pattern came in early April, when German forces in northern Italy began secret negotiations with Allied intelligence services in Switzerland. The talks, codenamed Operation Sunrise, were initiated by SS General Karl Wolff, who commanded German and Italian fascist forces south of the Alps. Wolff's proposal was straightforward. His forces would surrender to the Western Allies in exchange for guarantees that they would not be transferred to Soviet custody, and that the existing administrative structure in northern Italy would be preserved during the transition to Allied control. The negotiations proceeded in complete secrecy, unknown to the Soviet government and unauthorized by the combined chiefs of staff. American intelligence operatives, working through Swiss intermediaries, found Wolff's proposal strategically attractive. A German surrender in Italy would eliminate the need for a costly offensive through the Alpine passes, preserve Italian industrial capacity for post-war reconstruction, and potentially provide a model for similar negotiations with German commanders in other theaters. But when Stalin learned of the Swiss talks through Soviet intelligence networks, his response was immediate and furious. In a series of increasingly heated exchanges with Roosevelt and Churchill, the Soviet leader accused the Western Allies of conducting secret negotiations with the enemy, while Soviet forces continued to bear the primary burden of combat against German resistance. More ominously, Stalin suggested that the Western Allies were deliberately seeking separate peace arrangements that would preserve German military capacity for use against the Soviet Union in a future conflict. The accusations were not entirely without foundation. Some American and British officials had indeed begun to view the Soviet Union as a potential future adversary and were exploring ways to maintain Western influence in Central Europe as a counterweight to Soviet expansion. But the immediate issue was not grand strategy, but simple military efficiency. German willingness to surrender to Western forces while continuing resistance against Soviet forces created obvious tactical advantages that field commanders were naturally inclined to exploit. The crisis came to a head in the first week of May 1945, as German resistance finally collapsed on all fronts simultaneously. Hitler's suicide on April 30 had eliminated the primary source of fanatical resistance, while the fall of Berlin to Soviet forces on May 2 had destroyed the last symbol of Nazi authority. The remaining German leadership, now headed by Admiral Karl Dönitz, faced the impossible task of negotiating a surrender that would satisfy the military realities on the ground while preserving some minimal protection for German civilians and military personnel. Dönitz's strategy was elegant in its simplicity and catastrophic in its implications. Rather than seeking a general surrender to all Allied forces simultaneously, he authorized his representatives to negotiate separate capitulations with Western and Soviet commanders, timing these surrenders to maximize the number of German troops and civilians who could escape Soviet custody by surrendering to American or British forces instead. The plan began to unfold on May 4, when German forces in northwestern Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands surrendered to British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery at Lüneburg Heath. The surrender was presented as a local military necessity, but its political implications were immediately apparent. Hundreds of thousands of German troops, along with millions of civilians in the surrendered territories, were now under Western rather than Soviet control. 3 days later, on May 7, the climactic moment arrived at a schoolhouse in Reims, France, where General Alfred Jodl, representing the German High Command, signed an instrument of unconditional surrender in the presence of Allied representatives. The ceremony was intended to formalize the end of hostilities on all fronts, but its political choreography revealed the fundamental tensions that were already fracturing the Grand Alliance. Present at the signing were Lieutenant General Walter Bedell Smith, representing the United States, General François Severs, representing France, and Major General Ivan Susloparov, representing the Soviet Union. But Susloparov's authority was limited. He could witness the surrender, but not accept it on behalf of the Soviet government. Stalin had insisted that any German surrender must be ratified by a separate ceremony in Berlin, conducted by the Supreme Soviet Commander, in the presence of representatives from all Allied nations. The result was a bureaucratic nightmare that perfectly captured the emerging political dynamics of the post-war world. The Reims surrender was legally binding on all German forces, but it was not politically acceptable to the Soviet Union. Stalin viewed the ceremony as an attempt by the Western Allies to claim primary credit for Germany's defeat, while relegating the Soviet Union to a secondary role, despite the fact that Soviet forces had borne the heaviest burden of combat and suffered the greatest casualties in the war against Germany. The Western perspective was equally understandable. Allied forces had accepted the surrender of German armies across a vast front extending from Norway to Italy, and it seemed both natural and necessary to formalize these capitulations through a single comprehensive ceremony. The suggestion that this ceremony should be repeated in Berlin, under Soviet supervision, struck many Western officials as an unnecessary political theater designed to enhance Soviet prestige at the expense of military efficiency. But the deeper issue was not ceremonial protocol, but the practical consequences of how the surrender was managed. Every day that elapsed between local German capitulations and a final comprehensive surrender provided additional opportunities for German forces to escape Soviet custody by surrendering to Western armies instead. Soviet intelligence services reported that entire German divisions were deliberately delaying their surrender until they could reach American or British lines, while German civilian authorities were organizing mass evacuations from Soviet-occupied territories into Western zones of control. The numbers were staggering. In the final weeks of the war, an estimated 2 million German military personnel and 3 million civilians crossed from Soviet to Western zones of occupation, fundamentally altering the demographic and political balance of post-war Germany. These population movements were not random. They reflected a deliberate German strategy to minimize Soviet control over German territory and population, while maximizing Western influence in the eventual peace settlement. Stalin's insistence on a second surrender ceremony in Berlin was thus not merely symbolic but strategically essential. On May 8, 1945, in a hall at the former Wehrmacht engineering school in Berlin-Karlshorst, Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel signed a second instrument of German surrender, this time in the presence of Marshal Georgy Zhukov for the Soviet Union, Air Chief Marshal Arthur Tedder for Britain, General Karl Spaatz for the United States, and General Jean de Lattre de Tassigny for France. The Berlin ceremony was designed to demonstrate Allied unity and Soviet equality in the victory over Germany, but it succeeded primarily in highlighting the tensions that had emerged during the final phase of the war. Keitel's presence was itself a compromise. The German leadership had wanted to send a less senior officer, arguing that the Reims surrender had already fulfilled all legal requirements for capitulation. But Zhukov insisted on a high-ranking German representative who could credibly speak for the entire Wehrmacht, making clear that the Soviet Union would not accept a secondary role in Germany's final defeat. The ceremony proceeded with mechanical precision, but the political subtext was unmistakable. Each Allied representative spoke in turn, emphasizing their nation's contribution to victory and their vision for post-war Europe. The translations were careful and diplomatic, but the underlying message was clear. The Grand Alliance had achieved its military objectives, but it had not resolved the fundamental contradictions that would shape the peace. More significantly, the delay between the Reims and Berlin surrenders had provided additional time for the massive population movements that were already reshaping the demographic landscape of Central Europe. German civilians continued to flee westward, often with the tacit cooperation of German military commanders who were themselves eager to avoid Soviet custody. Soviet forces, meanwhile, began implementing political and economic changes in their occupied territories that went far beyond what had been agreed upon among the Allied leadership. The separate surrenders had thus created a fait accompli that no amount of ceremonial unity could reverse. By the time the Berlin ceremony concluded, the practical division of Germany into Western and Soviet spheres of influence was already well advanced, not as the result of any deliberate Allied strategy, but as the unintended consequence of how the German capitulation had been managed. The irony was profound. The Allied leadership had spent months planning for the political organization of post-war Germany, developing elaborate schemes for four power occupation zones, joint administration of major cities, and coordinated policies for denazification and reconstruction. But these careful plans were undermined by the simple fact that the German surrender had not occurred as a single coordinated event, but as a series of separate capitulations that reflected and reinforced the political divisions among the victorious Allies. The consequences of Germany's separate surrenders became apparent within weeks of the war's end. The population movements of the final days had created a stark demographic reality. The Soviet zone of occupation contained a significantly smaller German population than originally anticipated, while the Western zones were overwhelmed with refugees who had fled Soviet advance. This demographic imbalance immediately translated into political and economic advantages for the Western Allies, who found themselves administering territories with higher population densities, more intact industrial capacity, and more cooperative civilian leadership. The Soviet response was swift and systematic. Unable to reverse the population movements that had occurred during the surrender period, Stalin's government began implementing policies designed to maximize Soviet control over the territories and populations that remained under its authority. The process of political transformation that had begun during the military advance was accelerated and systematized, with existing German administrative structures replaced by Soviet-controlled institutions and German economic resources redirected toward Soviet reconstruction priorities. In the Western zones, military commanders found themselves managing a complex humanitarian crisis while attempting to implement occupation policies that had been designed for very different circumstances. The massive influx of refugees from the Soviet zone strained food supplies, housing, and medical services, while creating political pressures for policies that would protect these populations from forced repatriation. The result was a gradual but irreversible divergence in occupation policies between Western and Soviet zones. By the end of 1945, less than 8 months after Germany's surrender, the outlines of a divided Germany were already clearly visible. The Soviet zone had been transformed into a satellite state, operating according to Soviet political and economic principles, while the Western zones maintained democratic institutions and market-oriented economic policies. The four-power occupation that had been envisioned by Allied planners existed only in Berlin, where it functioned as a constant source of friction between former Allies who now viewed each other with increasing suspicion. The separate surrenders had created more than administrative complications. They had established the geographical and political framework for what would become the Cold War division of Europe. The lines of surrender became lines of occupation, which became lines of political control, which ultimately became the Iron Curtain that would divide Europe for the next 4 decades. The process was not inevitable. Other outcomes were possible if the German surrender had been managed differently. But the specific sequence of events that unfolded in April and May 1945 created a momentum toward division that proved impossible to reverse. Each separate surrender created new facts on the ground that influenced subsequent decisions, until the temporary military arrangements of the immediate post-war period had hardened into permanent political boundaries. The transformation was visible in the physical landscape as well as the political map. Within 2 years of Germany's surrender, the zones of occupation had developed distinct characteristics that reflected the different approaches of their administering powers. The Soviet zone featured centralized economic planning, collective agriculture, and extensive security apparatus designed to prevent population movement to the west. The Western zones developed federal political structures, mixed economies combining private enterprise with social welfare systems, and relatively open borders that facilitated trade and cultural exchange with neighboring countries. These differences were not merely administrative but philosophical, reflecting incompatible visions of human organization that had been temporarily suppressed by the common struggle against Nazi Germany. The separate surrenders had allowed these philosophical differences to translate directly into geographical reality, creating competing models of social organization that existed in immediate proximity to each other. The result was a natural experiment in political economy that neither side had intended, but both sides were compelled to pursue. The division of Germany became a laboratory for testing different approaches to reconstruction, denazification, and democratization, with each side seeking to demonstrate the superiority of its own system through the success of its occupation policies. But the experiment was conducted under conditions that made objective evaluation impossible. The massive population movements during the surrender period had created demographic conditions that favored Western approaches, while Soviet policies were shaped by security concerns that prioritized control over efficiency. The competition between systems was thus embedded in circumstances that had been created by the specific manner of Germany's capitulation, rather than by the inherent characteristics of the competing ideologies. The long-term consequences extended far beyond Germany itself. The division of Germany became the central symbol and practical foundation of the broader Cold War conflict, providing both sides with a tangible representation of what was at stake in their ideological competition. The Berlin Wall, when it was finally constructed in 1961, was not merely a barrier between East and West Berlin, but the physical manifestation of the political logic that had been set in motion by the separate surrenders of 1945. More broadly, the German experience became a template for understanding how post-war settlements could shape long-term international relations. The manner in which wars ended, it became clear, was often more important than how they were fought. Military victory created opportunities for political transformation, but the specific mechanisms through which those opportunities were exploited determined whether the resulting peace would be stable or unstable, unifying or divisive. The story of Germany's separate surrenders offers profound lessons about the relationship between military success and political settlement, between tactical efficiency and strategic wisdom, between the momentum of victory and the architecture of peace. These lessons remain relevant, not merely as historical curiosities, but as practical guidance for understanding how conflicts end and how their endings shape the world that emerges from their conclusion. The first lesson concerns the political consequences of military arrangements. The Allied leadership in 1945 understood that military victory must be translated into political settlement, but they underestimated how profoundly the specific mechanisms of military victory would influence the character of that settlement. The timing and geography of German surrenders were treated as tactical questions, but they proved to have strategic implications that outlasted the war itself by decades. The second lesson involves the relationship between alliance unity and individual national interests. The Grand Alliance succeeded brilliantly in coordinating military strategy against a common enemy, but it failed to develop mechanisms for managing the competing interests that emerged once that enemy had been defeated. The separate surrenders were symptoms of this failure rather than its cause, but they accelerated the process by which tactical cooperation gave way to strategic competition. The third lesson concerns the unintended consequences of humanitarian considerations. The massive population movements that occurred during Germany's final weeks were partly the result of legitimate fears about Soviet treatment of German civilians and military personnel. But the practical effect of these movements was to create demographic and political conditions that made accommodation between former allies more difficult rather than easier. Perhaps most importantly, the German experience demonstrates the fundamental importance of planning not just for victory, but for the day after victory. The Allied leadership devoted enormous resources to developing military strategy, but relatively little attention to the practical mechanics of how that strategy would be implemented in the final phase of the war. The result was a series of improvised decisions that had consequences no one had anticipated or intended. The machinery of peace, it became clear, required the same careful engineering that had characterized the machinery of war. Victory created opportunities, but only thoughtful planning could ensure that those opportunities were translated into lasting settlement rather than new sources of conflict. The separate surrenders of 1945 represent a case study in how the absence of such planning can transform military success into political failure, how tactical brilliance can coexist with strategic blindness, and how the end of one conflict can become the beginning of another. In our own time, as new conflicts emerge and existing conflicts seek resolution, the lessons of 1945 remain urgently relevant. The manner in which wars end continues to shape the peace that follows, and the specific mechanisms through which military victory is translated into political settlement continue to determine whether that peace will be stable or fragile, inclusive or divisive, lasting or temporary. The architecture of peace requires the same precision, the same attention to detail, and the same understanding of systems and consequences that characterizes any complex engineering project. The separate surrenders of Germany in 1945 offer a masterclass in how even the most carefully planned enterprises can be undermined by insufficient attention to the final, crucial phase of implementation. The price of that inattention was measured not in months or years but in decades. A divided Germany, a divided Europe, and a Cold War that shaped international relations until the end of the 20th century. It was a price paid not only by the politicians and generals who made the decisions, but by millions of ordinary people who lived with the consequences of those decisions for the remainder of their lives. This is the ultimate lesson of the separate surrenders, that the manner in which conflicts end is not merely a technical question, but a moral one, involving choices that will shape the lives of future generations. The responsibility for making those choices wisely belongs not only to political and military leaders, but to all citizens who participate in democratic societies, and who therefore bear some measure of responsibility for the decisions made in their name. The machinery of peace, like any other form of machinery, can be designed well or poorly, can be operated skillfully or carelessly, can serve human purposes or defeat them. The choice, as always, remains ours to make.